So I watched the Jim Crow documentary, and the first thing that struck me was the explanation of Jim Crow and basically what I see as continuing today with particular stereotypes still occurring and it being seen as a way to empower African Americans today, um, while while still holding them down in a way that harkens back to the the early 1800s, and the creation of Jim Crow. I see it in things like Medea, which is made by Tyler Perry, and is kind of pokes fun at those stereotypes, but still it is a profitable way that is pushed by by the mostly white corporate media in Hollywood, still making a profit off of these stereotypes and the continuing of these stereotypes, especially in African American music. Um, Another thing that really stood out to me was how lynching was viewed in white culture in the late 1800s, that it was communal, religious, and patriotic, that it was a family affair. Pictures and videos throughout the documentary um, showed families partaking in lynchings as if it was some excuse to gather, which is what they did. That was disturbing. Also, Booker T. Washington's speech at the convention in 1985, criticizing his own people for seeking political and economic power during the Reconstruction. Basically, he wanted African Americans at the time to work within the system, um, within the established system of civil rights, um, and avoid agitating, which the whites at the time absolutely loved. Seeing the reaction and hearing the reaction in accounts during the documentary was, again, kind of disturbing. I'm looking for another word for it, but that's all I can come up with. Um, Another thing was the police and prison systems being used to basically re-enslave African Americans, as a profitable way to continue building infrastructure, which to me is kind of like the current climate of college athletics, in which African Americans make up a large bulk of the college basketball and college football um, uh, student athletes, and producing a ton of revenue and therefore profit for these um, sometimes public institutions that are supposed to be um, government assisted. Another thing is Du Bois and Washington, to me, seeming a little, well, the juxtaposition between the two seeming a little like the Martin Luther King Jr. versus Malcolm X juxtaposition. Um, I mean, they took place in very different climates, but I see their, not rivalry, but their differing opinions as somewhat comparable. Another thing was the fact that fighting in a war was not enough to bring African American and white soldiers together, despite the fact that in World War One, the French were very accepting of African Americans fighting with them. The last thing I'll touch on is Gordon Parks, the Gainesville, Georgia resident, who talked about lynching, whose father was the Grand Wizard, um, that guy was crazy. It was very startling, his account. He seemed borderline proud of um, his family history as far as that one was involved, and used the N word like it wasn't even a thing, which was concerning.